Hello everyone and welcome to round number 2 in our August 2v2 tournament. This time we've got Dubin Steph up against PB Game Slayer. Both of these teams did lose their initial round, and so it'll be interesting to see who is going to come out on top and manage to be the first to put a point on the board this time. I was a bit questionable about PB and Game Slayer's initial founding locations last time. I thought there was something pretty obvious to do that didn't happen. So it'll be interesting to see if they clean that up this time, what they adjust, if they shift anything around. We can see PB once again has gone for a quick scientific, whereas Steph and Dubin both have claimed expansive. Steph, it looks like, is going to be our steel producer, while Dubin is grabbing the aluminum for his team. Game Slayer, he immediately hits HQ level 2 on founding. PB not too far behind, so that's just going to be a nice quick little boost for them. Steph and Dubin, of course, as they upgrade, will receive very great benefits out of it, as both of them are expansive. But this should indicate to us that Steph and Dubin, maybe their general game plan for these is going to be a bit long-term, in that they're both expansive. They're going to be wanting to push to the late game when their tile advantages can really come into their own, when their cheap off-worlds will have more and more relevance, whereas Game Slayer and PB, they're still looking like they want to push things quick. This isn't a variation off of last time. This is basically very, very similar to what they did, with Game Slayer getting on the board a little bit quicker and not going after a power play either. He does have effectively no debt, so he will be able to move into power, and you can see he has started to do that now with these 3 wind turbines, but it wasn't the level 1 immediate solar panel that we saw in the last game. Just a level 2 power instead of the level 1. PB once again with a large amount of debt. I don't think as much as last game. May have been a bit more confident with a couple of adequate scientific locations. Obviously this is the preferred one as it has access to water as well as steel, but if PB was only interested in steel, he could have taken a northwest area, potentially set himself up for aluminum as well if Game Slayer hadn't, or he could have just taken this northern area and had a very large patch of steel to work with. Game Slayer is going to be nuked out very, very quickly, likely on a medium patch that he had there. It will be knocked down to trace, so that's just going to damage PB and Game Slayer's aluminum production. I doubt they're going to be too concerned over that, as they do, of course, use less aluminum, since Game Slayer is a robotic player, doesn't need quite as much of that to get through to his upgrades. We can see Game Slayer's also managed to push to HQ level 3 already. Going to choose to grab a couple of nearby silicon tiles. Game Slayer stuck on the low silicon, which he's not likely to be happy about, but seems like it was rather necessary in order for him to have access to decent aluminum, that he had to pass up on the strong silicon that might have been available. PB has a little bit more powerful silicon, a bit closer. Could have maybe taken a medium and a high easily, so that the whole team only committed 2 tiles that direction. But the question is, what does Game Slayer actually do at that point with his current tile setup? You can see Game Slayer has also chosen to go after farms, so that'll be just a nice little bit of money in his pocket. On-world prices aren't really all that excessive right now. You can see that the colony is a decent size with a fair number of habitats, also laboratories available, but Kim started quite cheap, so we're not going to see players move into that immediately this game. There's a tile auction right on our colony at the moment, but it doesn't look particularly attractive to me. It is, of course, a tile, and tiles always have their benefits. You can see, by the way, that PB is the one who's choosing to go after all these auctions for his team, as he is the player who's trying to accumulate that debt, whereas Game Slayer, they're trying to leave open so he can continue to make money from power as that is available. Of course, right now, power is not particularly expensive, so maybe a bit less of a concern, but still something to keep in mind. Meanwhile, Steph and Dubin, because of when they founded, PB and Game Slayer seem to very, very highly value this potential power income. And so that's why Game Slayers always seem to be waiting for last in order to found, is so that he can make money from power. Steph and Dubin don't value that as much. They are willing to take on debt unevenly, potentially sacrifice that power income and instead simply try and make sure that they both set themselves up in the best possible position for other resources and fighting for other resources on the market. Let's see. Don't see too much power production out of either of them just yet. It's likely going to be Steph who focuses on it this game, as he does have plenty of geotherms nearby, and of course, both players being expansive can use those geotherms quite effectively. Nothing too surprising out of any of our teams thus far. PB and Gameslayer look like they have a bit of an advantage here, with Gameslayer just a touch ahead on upgrades, up at 4 as opposed to the 3 of all of our other players. PB and Gameslayer also with a fair amount of cash available between them, it looks like, whereas Dubin, he also has some money in the bank with all this silicon, very, very high silicon price now. Well, but more nukes coming out. Resources are just getting a little bit more difficult to fight over time. Let's see. Got some electronics factories out of Gameslayer. Once again, not too surprising. Aluminum is quite cheap right now, so just very easily transitioning. So he has a little aluminum coming in still, but most of these tiles are now committed to the slightly more valuable electronics production that they can provide. I am wondering, we do have just a hair of carbon income for Gameslayer here. That's a very nukeable tile in a lot of ways. Pretty easy to knock that down to just a trace carbon tile, and so I do wonder if Gameslayer is going to commit one additional carbon up to something like this high tile up here later in the game, just in case electronics and chemicals hold their very, very high value relative to all these other resources. High silicon auction. Players thinking about it. Looks like both teams are willing to commit at least a little bit to it. PB, of course, 7,000. Looks like he's going to end up with it. He is the auction buyer for his team. And so I do wonder if he's going to use that for silicon. Silicon is a bit expensive right now, but he will need to worry about the fuel prices associated with them. It is an elemental quarry that's on the way for PB, so that is what we're going to be seeing. I was wondering if he would choose to go for a solar panel in particular, but you can see that Gameslayer and PB, they don't have a lot of silicon income right now with just these pair of lows. So I'm really not very surprised to see that they have chosen to go after that silicon tile. PB with a bit of a mistake, it looks like, running this glass kiln, which is certainly losing money for the time being. Just going to be a nice benefit to Dubin and Steph, who have that silicon production at the moment. Let's see, all players HQ4. Gameslayer and PB once again with, it looks like, that slight lead. I find it interesting that Gameslayer was the one to go after the Pleasure Dome. Guess it doesn't make too much difference with our players both sharing power at this point, and maybe you could look at it as Gameslayer should be the one to take most of the advanced buildings, as PB's claims should consistently have more value because he has scientific buildings and they can be placed directly on top of resources, pull that resource out of the ground in order to power that secondary building very, very easily, of course. So you can look at it that way, where Gameslayer should, if there is an advanced building that can kind of be shared like that Pleasure Dome, or maybe a hacker array, it should likely be Gameslayer as the player to put that building down. Well, they've got enough of a stockpile now. Gameslayer's really been raking in the cash off of it. Looks like partially power, although power costs have gotten a bit high for that at the moment. But also just the food and having enough of electronics production for so long. The Gameslayer, it looks like he might be able to push to that majority. They've got almost enough cash scraped together. Will Gameslayer find it? Looks like he did. Just barely. So Steph and Dubin, once again, it looks like struggling with their late game plays. They were just so close to being able to defend against that majority. I think if they had, then we likely would have seen a bit more success out of Dubin and Steph this game, considering they were both expansive. We were pushing to HQ5, we were pushing to Offworlds becoming valuable, but moving forward here, of course, it's just a majority buyout, so no additional claims. for Game Slayer. Only 6 stock instead of 10, so not getting the full income off of the subsidiary. However, it's still going to be that majority buyout HQ, still 60% of its income toward Game Slayer, with Game Slayer and PB both still on HQ4. Game Slayer's now picked up Thinking Machines, which may have just been a safeguard, potentially, against Steph and Dubin acquiring it. Also will be helpful if he chooses to build something like an Offworld this game, which I wouldn't be too terribly surprised to see in order to finish the game pretty solidly. You just move into the Offworld. Steel is very, very cheap. Electronics not too expensive either. That guarantees kind of your long-term income very, very easily. I would like to see them, if they're going to make this play, start purchasing into maybe some of that steel just about now. Obviously, they're still producing electronics, and glass is still very, very cheap, so that wouldn't be an issue. We're going to see Game Slayer instead commit to virtual reality for the time being. This is an interesting thing about the 2v2 environment, where you're unlikely to end up with a large number of pleasure domes, because each team isn't going to want to get in the way of their other player pulling in cash off the pleasure dome. But pleasure domes will probably tend to be a bit valuable. You can see that even with the 2 domes down, we've got 130 and 141. Steph is going to commit to another dome, probably because what else do you actually put on that tile location? This one that came off of an auction. Going to knock prices down just a bit more, but you can see with virtual reality coming in, Game Slayer is still going to be pulling in plenty off of his dome. Also worth noting that maybe the domes don't look too great, but when you compare them to something like the food over here that's just losing money because of the dust storm, maybe these silicon tiles, they're not great either. The steel, even after that Offworld that just got started from Game Slayer, not too big a surprise there, just guarantees the game in his favor easily, effectively. Although I am a bit surprised by that upgrade, because that didn't seem like it had a whole lot of purpose after the Offworld had come down. But you can see, getting back to the point, that most of these tiles are making less money than this virtual reality pleasure dome in particular, and even these other pleasure domes still more valuable than most other production this game. You can see this is why I was a bit skeptical about the upgrade from Game Slayer in particular. I think without that, there was maybe a chance that he could have just ended the game pretty soon, as Steph is being threatened to be bought out pretty easily here. I do like to see all of this carbon production from Game Slayer. He actually committed a lot more than I was expecting him to all this carbon, because carbon ended up quite valuable. Offworld Market may not even have the time to do anything this game. Committing to it would just take money out of Game Slayer's pocket. And yep, Game Slayer PB pretty easily gonna take round number 2 here in day 5, so a bit longer than the Soul 4 game that Dubin and Steph were in last time, but you can see Game Slayer and PB, their early game strategy far more successful this time, as they were able to push to that majority buyout. And once you've kind of knocked over half of the opposing team, then you're going to be okay in trying to eliminate the second player the vast majority of the time, unless they can also push to a quick majority buyout. So good stuff out of PB and Game Slayer. Nice to see their plan come together a bit better that game. Dubin and Steph may have to rethink things. I don't know how Game 1 went down, but it's pretty clear that they're wanting these games to go longer than they are, and just don't quite have the cash put together to make it happen. So we'll have to see if they make any adjustments moving forward in this tournament.